Shipmack here, and I am starting a multi-part series on aerodynamics of forward flight. This is going to be part one, so we're just going to get into the very basics of forward flight and what's going on with the rotor system as you enter forward flight. Starts to become pretty complex, so I'm going to break that up into a couple different parts. There's a lot to forward flight, so what I want to try to do is get it to where we build that up little by little so that as we get to the more complex topics, it makes a little bit more sense. So what I've got right here is just a representation of the aircraft, and we are going to assume for the time being that it is in a hover. At any point throughout the flight, we have four basic force principles that act on this helicopter. All right, so we have lift. This is generated by the rotor system, and as a reminder, it is always generated perpendicular to the rotor disc. Now, I say disc. If you look at a disc from the side, it is a line. So right here, this is the disc. Our force vector is perpendicular, meaning 90 degrees to the rotor disc. Always acting on the center of gravity and pointing towards the center of the Earth is the weight vector. All right, this is always pulling the aircraft towards the center of the Earth. We have acceleration. Acceleration could be pointed forwards or backwards. For the purposes of this, it's forwards or backwards. And then we have drag. Drag only happens when the aircraft is in motion. So if we were in a hover right now, our drag would be 0. Alright, so if we would like to move the aircraft in any direction, we must tilt the aircraft in that direction. And when we do that, we'll notice that because the rotor disc has tilted, this tilts our lift vector. So again, always perpendicular to the rotor disc. And we'll notice that the lift vector is no longer in direct opposition to our weight vector because our weight vector does not change. Remember, it always points toward the center of the Earth. When we tilt forward, our lift vector is divided into a vertical component of the lift vector, which always acts in opposition to the weight vector. But we'll notice because this is a component of the lift vector, and that component can be calculated using the Pythagorean theorem, that this is always going to be less than this. So if we were at a stabilized hover and we tilted forward, then we would no longer be in a stabilized altitude vertically because the vertical component of that lift is not enough to oppose the weight, assuming that this was configured to oppose the weight. And this is, for the purposes of right now, this is entirely dependent on the amount of collective that you have applied. So if you're in a stabilized hover and you have a certain amount of collective applied, if you tilt the nose forward, the aircraft will begin to descend because you are borrowing some of this lift vector for acceleration. So the horizontal component of the lift vector that is perpendicular to the vertical component is acceleration. This is the part of the vector that we use for acceleration. So this is why this is no longer enough to keep us in the air. We borrow some of this force to be used to accelerate the craft forward, which leaves us with less to keep it in the air. Now we can counter this by pulling more collective, or we can allow the aircraft to settle. As the aircraft starts to pick up speed due to this acceleration, that speed is opposed by drag. This is called parasitic drag. So as the air flows across this aircraft, all along the aircraft, we are going to experience drag. All right, so that drag is going to be both air slamming into the surfaces of the aircraft and also flowing along the sides, almost like profile drag of the blades. It's very similar. In fact, it's probably called profile drag along the side of the aircraft. So your laminar flow along the aircraft kind of drags at it, and then at the back, as the vortices are shed off the back of the aircraft, it sucks on the back of the aircraft. So all of this combines into parasitic drag and wants to slow down the aircraft. Now, this acceleration vector will continue to accelerate the aircraft faster. And the faster this aircraft goes, the more drag we create. Now, as this drag gets large enough, the sum of all drag across all of this aircraft will equal the acceleration vector. And when it does, we will have steady state speed. That's when we will maintain our airspeed. We will no longer be accelerating or decelerating. We will be at a constant speed. If we would like to slow down the aircraft, we tilt the nose up. We'll notice that our total lift vector is now angled backwards, and our subcomponents of lift are still divided in the vertical and horizontal, but now the horizontal is opposing the forward speed and will slow down the aircraft. We are not at this point talking about what that does to the angle of attack of the blades, an additional lift or a loss of lift that occurs. That will be a later video because we're trying to build this up piecemeal. So right now, we're going to disregard the changes in angle of attack due to the relative wind entering the rotor system as the disc changes angles. So do not worry about that. Understand that it gets more complex, but we're not going to worry about that right now. All we're worried about right now is this lift vector being divided up and manipulated in order to do what you want with the craft. Now, we're talking about this nose up and nose down, but as we roll right and roll left, these same things happen. This lift vector would be divided into the vertical component, and the horizontal component would be either facing towards you or away from you. And then this acceleration vector can point in any direction in 360 degrees in order to tilt the craft in that direction. All right, so up until now, we have assumed that the lift is constant cyclically around the rotor disc. Okay. In the Aerodynamics of Hovering Flight video, we talked about how we can manipulate the swash plate in order to change the pitch of these blades cyclically, which would change these values. And I want to point out that these are not the values at the tip, the middle, and the root. Okay, imagine that these are in a circle. This is the lift of the whole blade being represented only at the tip. This is at the tip, but at the, say, 7 o'clock position. This is at the tip, but at the 8 o'clock position, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, off the nose. And then there would be corresponding at the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock positions. Okay, so what we're talking about is cyclically in a circle around the rotor disc. It is all the same. All right, so from the top, what we're looking at is the side profile of the blade on the right side of the aircraft. And this is the side profile of the blade on the left side of the aircraft. These blue lines represent the rotational relative wind that is flowing over the rotor blade. We are at a hover. Now, as we start to move forward, wind will begin to enter the rotor disc. In the middle, the wind enters the rotor disc at a 90-degree angle to rotational relative velocity, which has no effect because the only thing we care about as far as generating lift is the air that flows perpendicular. So if air is flowing along this rotor blade, so either from the tip to the root or from the root to the tip, that neither generates lift nor degrades lift. It has no effect on it. So this right here, the wind that is entering the nose or the tail of the disc is flowing along the blade from tip to root off the nose and from root to tip off the tail. So the wind flowing through the middle of the rotor disc has no effect. However, the wind entering the sides of the disc do. So you'll notice right there, as the wind enters the rotor disc, opposing the blades, the wind is flowing against the direction of rotation. It increases the total relative wind flowing across that blade. By the same token, down here on the left side of the disc as we're flying along, we are flying with the blade. Now the blades are spinning much faster than the wind, so it's still generating plenty of lift. However, that lift is slightly degraded, just as the amount of wind entering the disc on this side is very minute compared to the amount of wind from rotational relative velocity. All right, we call this side the advancing side and this side the retreating side, because this side the blade is advancing toward the wind and this side the blade is retreating from the wind. Okay, so there's several ways that we can account for this and maintain the aircraft in stabilized flight. The first of which is called feathering. So that is done manually by the pilot. Now remember, due to gyroscopic precession, the inputs of the cyclic happen 90 degrees out of phase. So the effect of the pitching of the blades happen 90 degrees out of phase in the direction of rotation, which means the inputs from the pilot are transmitted to the rotor system 90 degrees out of phase against the direction of rotation, so that when they take effect in the position that the pilot wants them to take effect. So when we push forward on cyclic, what we are doing is we are causing the disc to move down in the front and up in the back. In order to do that, we must decrease the pitch on the right side and increase the pitch on the left side. So pushing forward on the cyclic will account for dissymmetry of lift between the advancing and retreating blades. So as the pilot pushes forward on the cyclic, the blade that is flying in more total relative wind will lower its angle of attack, and the blade that is flying in less total relative wind will increase its angle of attack. And this is why you must maintain forward cyclic as you fly through the air. It is to correct this dissymmetry of lift. A second method is built in to the design of the aircraft. Now there's several different ways that the aircraft can do this. Some aircraft have a teetering rotor system, so it's like a teeter-totter. Some aircraft have articulation, which means here at the root of the blade there's a mechanism that allows this blade to move up and down. The H-145 has glass fiber reinforced plastic blades. The blades are literally plastic. It's a little more advanced than that, but they are extremely flexible, and they flex all along the entirety of the blade throughout the flight. There's actually a really cool video. I will link it down here, and you can watch. The Red Bull helicopter has mounted a camera on their rotor hub looking down the blade, and you can watch this thing. You can watch all of these forces happening in flight. I would highly recommend they slowed it down so that you could see what's going on, and you can see the feathering, the cyclic feathering of the blades in forward flight. You can also see the flapping, and to a small degree you can see the next concept that we're going to talk about. But for now, what we're talking about right now is the blades will flap. Okay, so what that means is flapping just like a bird. It will move up and down. So we're going to imagine that we're sitting on the nose of the aircraft and we're looking at the rotor disc. The aircraft is flying towards us. So this would be the right side of the aircraft. This would be the left side of the aircraft. So the right side of the aircraft is advancing against the wind. The left side of the aircraft is retreating from the wind. So the right side of the aircraft is going to flap up as it enters a larger total relative wind due to rotational and forward flight. If we remember, this total relative wind vector is divided between the rotational relative wind and the wind due to the forward speed of the aircraft. So as this blade flaps upward, the rotational relative vector is canted downward because the blade is flying upwards through the wind. This causes the total relative wind vector to be deflected downward. When that happens, it lowers the angle of attack and generates less lift on that blade. Now, as the blade comes around the front of the aircraft, it is going to begin to retreat from the wind, which means that it is going to flap downward. Now, if we remember, our total relative wind vector up here consists of the rotational relative wind minus the induced wind due to the forward speed of the helicopter, because the blade is retreating from that wind. Now, the same thing happens on this side, although it's the opposite. As the blade flaps downward, it is going to flap against the wind, thereby increasing the angle of attack and increasing the total relative wind vector against the blade, increases the total lift generated by this blade. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is lead lag. Okay, so in articulated systems, here at the root, the blade is allowed to lead and lag forwards and backwards. The H-145, again having the glass fiber reinforced plastic blades, does have a small degree of lead lag. It's not as pronounced, but we're still going to talk about it because it is a force. All right, so as the blades are spinning, we have air due to rotational relative velocity that is in opposition to the direction that the blades are spinning. This force acts at some distance from the center of rotation. Okay? So the further out we are, the larger effect this has on it. As this moves inward, it has less of an effect on that blade because the blade is not moving as fast here towards the root as it is out here. Drag from this force will actually deflect the blades backwards, thereby shortening the distance at which this acts. Now you'll notice this did not rotate the head. It actually leaned the blade back. Now we need to remember that this blade is still moving perpendicular to this line, so this is still taking effect at this angle, just at this shortened distance from the center of rotation. Also note that the span of this blade is not perpendicular to its direction of travel. It's actually traveling perpendicular to the original span of where the blade would have been had it not lagged. This is important because the component of this vector, though it is perpendicular to this line and therefore acts along this line, when it's acting along the span of this lagged blade, a portion of that vector is now acting parallel to the span of that blade and is no longer providing useful lift. As the blades spin, you can see right here that this takes effect everywhere along the system. Now, over here is where we have the blade that is advancing against the air. This advancing causes this side to push back and this side to push back forward. Okay, so the blade lags as it flies against the wind, and it leads as it flies with the wind. As this blade lags behind, this line right here becomes even shorter, lowering the total lift of the blade. As it comes around to the left side of the aircraft, it is going to lead, which is going to increase the distance from the center of rotation, which increases the amount of lift that the blade is producing. All right, so that's it for the first portion of this. Like I said, I am going to dive deeper into aerodynamics of forward flight. There's probably going to be a 3-part series. I can't promise exactly how many it's going to be or what the timeline is, but look for it. Like and subscribe if you can. And if you got any questions, of course, please do not hesitate to drop them in the comments.